Deep within the halls of the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg hangs a painting that, at first glance, appears to be just another historical record of a tragic past. It is titled The Great Fire, and according to the official narrative, it depicts Moscow engulfed in flames in 1812. However, if we set aside standard perceptions and look at this work through the lens of physics and optics, one thing becomes clear. This is not merely artistic fiction, but a documentation of the impossible. Art historians often miss details that are glaringly obvious to experts in technogenic catastrophes. The fire on the canvas behaves in a way unnatural for burning wood or stone, and the destruction of the buildings does not follow the physics of a conventional fire. But the most unsettling detail lies in the background. Deep within the composition, there is a light source that defies explanation. This light is too white, too intense, and all-encompassing. It differs drastically from the warm, red-orange spectrum typical of burning organic materials. Those who have studied the chronicles of the 20th century will unmistakably recognize this visual signature. This glow is identical to what cameras captured during nuclear tests and the tragedy in Hiroshima. A painter working in the early 19th century reproduced, with frightening accuracy, the visual trace of a high-temperature explosion and hard radiation. A phenomenon humanity would officially discover only a century and a half later. This leads to a logical question that academic historians ignore. How could an artist of that era know what the epicenter of a nuclear detonation looks like? How did an effect caused by the release of colossal atomic energy end up on a canvas dating back to the age of muskets and cavalry? This discrepancy becomes the first crack in the monolithic structure of official history. We are told that the war with Napoleon was a classic conflict between two empires, decided by tactics, artillery, and the harsh Russian winter. Textbooks claim the Grand Army was defeated by partisan resistance and frost. But the painting in the Hermitage screams otherwise. It bears witness to an event that, in its destructive power, surpassed any weaponry known at that time. If we begin to cross-reference the facts, it becomes clear that the accepted timeline of 1812 crumbles the moment critical thinking is applied. The official version of scorched earth tactics fails to explain many anomalies recorded by eyewitnesses. We are on the verge of a discovery that could overturn our understanding of civilization's past, and this is just the beginning of the investigation. Before we dive into the documents they tried to hide or destroy, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your activity helps the truth break through the algorithms of the information blockade, allowing more people to learn what has been kept silent for 200 years. When studying the historical context, it is impossible to ignore the oddities surrounding this so-called invasion. 600,000 soldiers entered enemy territory, yet fewer than 10,000 returned. This is presented as the greatest military disaster in history, blamed on starvation and cold. However, the scale of the losses and the speed at which a massive army vanished resemble the consequences of entering a zone of mass destruction rather than the results of combat. The painting The Great Fire becomes the key to understanding that 1812 was not a war in the traditional sense, but a systematic extermination operation, the traces of which were carefully airbrushed by the victors. We are seeing not a fire, but a flash that changed the course of history, and this visual fact demands a detailed, impartial investigation that goes far beyond the school curriculum. Let's set aside artistic images for a moment and turn to the cold, hard facts of material science and thermodynamics. The official version of events begins to disintegrate instantly. For decades, we have been led to believe that the destruction of the greatest cities of the past was the result of ordinary fires caused by military action or negligence. However, physics is a stubborn science, and it casts doubt on the very possibility of such destruction, using early 19th century technology. The standard burning temperature of wood in open air, even with strong winds, rarely exceeds 800 or 900 degrees Celsius. This is enough to destroy wooden floors and roofs, but completely insufficient to alter the molecular structure of stone. In the reports from 1812, we encountered descriptions that contradict the properties of ordinary flames. Eyewitnesses and the few surviving documents state that the stone did not just crack from the heat, it melted. Granite and brick flowed like water, turning into a shapeless, glass-like mass. To bring construction stone or brick to a liquid state requires temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees, maintained over time, or a short-term but monstrously powerful thermal pulse. No torches, barrels of tar, or artillery gunpowder could create such conditions over vast open areas. Particular attention must be paid to the nature of the fire in Moscow itself. The city burned for 6 days, but this was not a gradual spread of fire from building to building. Descriptions point to the emergence of a phenomenon known as a firestorm. The intensity of the combustion was so high that the fire began to create its own weather. Powerful convective currents arose. Pressure differentials were such that the wind, sucked into the epicenter of the blaze, lifted adult men into the air and uprooted trees. Such atmospheric anomalies are characteristic of carpet bombings with incendiary mixtures in the 20th century, or the epicenters of nuclear explosions, where instantaneous heating of the air creates a vacuum zone. Buildings collapsed in ways that do not happen during ordinary fires, where interiors burn out first and then walls settle. Chronicles hint at instantaneous destruction, as if structures were swept away by a shock wave or lost their structural integrity in a split second. Stone turned to dust, metal evaporated or fused with brick into a single monolith. Official history tries to convince us that this was the result of chaotic arson during the retreat, but the coordination and totality of the destruction point to the use of technologies of a completely different order. This was a systematic wiping of the city from the face of the earth, a thermal processing of the territory that left no chance for anything living. However, the scale of the catastrophe was not limited to Eurasia alone. If you believe that this unexplained cataclysm was a local tragedy of the Russian Empire, you are deeply mistaken. At the very moment the stones of Moscow's streets were melting, similar processes, ignoring the laws of conventional warfare and the physics of combustion, were taking place on the other side of the planet, lining up into a frightening chain of global events. We are taught to view the events of 1812 in isolation, focusing on specific regional conflicts. History textbooks tell us about two completely different wars: the Patriotic War in Russia and the War of 1812 in the Americas. They try to convince us that these events are unconnected, aside from the calendar date. However, if we plot the points of catastrophic fires on a world map, a frightening picture of global synchronicity opens up to the researcher, one that cannot be written off as coincidence or standard military tactics. While Moscow was blazing, a similar scenario was unfolding thousands of kilometers away in North and South America, forming a single ring of fire that engulfed the planet. In the United States, 1812 is marked not just by combat, but by a series of devastating fires that destroyed key metropolises. Washington, D.C. burned so thoroughly that the president's residence, which we know as the White House, had to be virtually rebuilt from scratch. The official version claims this was the work of British troops, but the nature of the damage raises many questions. The fire destroyed stone and brick with the same inexplicable fury as in Russia. During the same period, New York lost its entire southern district in a fire whose cause remains unclear to this day. Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, the list of cities engulfed in flames within the same time frame is staggering. These were not local outbreaks, but the total annihilation of urban infrastructure occurring almost simultaneously across vast territories. Even more mysterious events were taking place in South America. On March 26, 1812, Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, was practically wiped off the face of the earth. Historians call it an earthquake, but surviving eyewitness accounts, including records from clergy, paint a different picture. They wrote not so much about the ground shaking, but that the earth was burning. The destruction was described as instantaneous and complete, with mentions that buildings did not just fall apart, but settled as if they were melting candles. Stone and structures showed signs of thermal deformation, uncharacteristic of seismic activity. Earthquakes can shatter walls, but they do not make minerals flow and change their structure. Thus, we see a global anomaly. Russia and America were not at war with each other. Their political and military conflicts had no direct points of contact. Yet cities on both continents burned with identical intensity, with identical inexplicable physical characteristics, and at the same time. It creates the impression of a coordinated strike, directed not against a specific army, but against centers of civilization as such. It was a singular signature of destruction that ignored state borders and political alliances. There is absolutely no logical connection between Napoleon's war and the fires in the New World if viewed as ordinary wars. But if we assume this was a global cleanup using high-power technologies, the puzzle pieces fit together perfectly. Official science continues to call this a series of tragic coincidences, blaming the chaos of war and natural disasters. However, the architecture of destruction is only one side of the coin. There is also a biological side, about which there is an even more stubborn silence. Archives hold diaries and medical reports from those years, describing the condition of survivors. The symptoms recorded by doctors in 1812 do not fit the profile of burns or infectious diseases of that era. They describe pathologies that modern medicine would only name in the second half of the 20th century, after the tragedies of Hiroshima and Chernobyl. The most terrifying evidence of the events of 1812 is not found in the ruined walls, but in the surviving paper archives, private letters, diaries, and the dry reports of field doctors who encountered something beyond their comprehension. When you begin to read these yellowed pages, true horror sets in. Not from the descriptions of battle scenes, but from how people struggled to find words for phenomena that simply had no names in their language. They described the apocalypse with childlike naivety, recording symptoms and physical effects that modern science classifies quite clearly, but which were impossible for the early 19th century. One of the most striking documents is a letter from a woman in Moscow describing the beginning of the catastrophe. She uses a phrase that makes a researcher freeze. First came a light brighter than 1,000 suns. She writes that they covered their faces with their hands, but the radiance seemed so powerful it felt as if it were burning through their flesh. This metaphor, brighter than 1,000 suns, is not just poetic imagery. It is a verbatim match for a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which Robert Oppenheimer would recite a century and a half later while watching the first nuclear test in the desert. The fact that this specific phrasing surfaces in letters from 1812 suggests that eyewitnesses observed light radiation of extreme intensity, characteristic of a nuclear reaction, not an ordinary fire. Witnesses clearly distinguished the stages. First, the unbearable light that turned night into day. Then a soundless pause, and only then came the strike, the sound and the wall of fire. Light preceding sound and the heat wave is the classic signature of a nuclear detonation. However, the real nightmare began later, when the fires died down. In medical reports of the time, doctors described a strange epidemic affecting both residents and soldiers near the fire epicenters. Doctors were in total confusion. Patients came to them with no visible mechanical wounds, no saber cuts or bullet holes. Their skin was not burned by fire in the usual sense, but it turned dark and peeled off in sheets, exposing raw tissue. People complained of uncontrollable nausea and sickness, often involving blood. Especially frightening was the symptom of mass hair loss. Healthy men and women lost clumps of hair simply by running a hand over their heads. This is not a symptom of typhus, cholera, or dysentery, the standard companions of war in that era. This is a textbook description of acute radiation syndrome. Patients faded away in days or weeks. Doctors wrote of internal rotting and the thinning of blood, noting that the patient's bodies stopped resisting any infections. Those who seemingly survived the fire itself and were at a safe distance perished a week later from an unknown ailment. They described the effects of penetrating radiation with clinical precision, without even suspecting what they were dealing with. Burns without fire. This is how medics characterized the condition, unaware that cells were being destroyed not by heat, but by an invisible stream of particles. These biological testimonies put an end to the just a fire version. Fire does not cause radiation sickness. Smoke does not cause hair to fall out or skin to slide off without thermal contact. We are dealing with documented facts of the use of a weapon that leaves a radioactive trace. And here, a logical contradiction arises, capable of collapsing the entire structure of the official history of the Napoleonic Wars. If Moscow and other cities turned into zones of high radioactive contamination, deadly to all living things, how could a massive invasion army exist and function in this environment? If the territory was a kill zone, what actually happened to the legendary Grand Army? And where did hundreds of thousands of armed and trained men vanish without a trace? Official historiography offers us a convenient and romanticized explanation for the demise of Napoleon's Grand Army. We are told of General Frost, of the harsh Russian winter that supposedly became the main victor in this campaign. However, anyone who takes the trouble to compare the climate records of that year with the timeline of the French troops' disappearance will discover a fatal discrepancy. The real deep freeze only hit in November, but by that moment, virtually nothing remained of the 600,000-strong force. The army ceased to exist as a combat unit back in October, during relatively mild weather. Where could 500,000 healthy, battle-hardened men vanish without a trace in such a short time, if there wasn't a single battle capable of grinding down such a number of people? The key to the riddle lies in the oddities of the timeline of Napoleon's entry into Moscow. Textbooks claim the fire started on September 14, 1812, and the emperor entered the capital on the same day. But no commander in his right mind would lead a massive army into the epicenter of a firestorm for quartering. That is suicide. Logic suggests a different sequence of events. The French entered a city that had already been struck. They entered not as conquerors ready for triumph and plunder, but as stalkers stepping into an exclusion zone. What they saw there, French military reports called Le Grand Silence, the Great Silence. Scouts reported a frightening picture that did not fit the concept of military evacuation. In the towns and villages on the road to Moscow, they found untouched houses. Belongings were in their places, ash was still warm in the stoves, and food was on set tables. Only the people were missing. This did not look like an organized retreat of the population, who usually take valuables and supplies with them. It looked like the instantaneous disappearance of a civilization, as if the population had been evacuated by a higher power, or destroyed by a weapon that leaves no bodies. Kilometer after kilometer, the army moved through the void, through ghost towns where life stopped in a single second. It was likely their presence in this zone that caused the army's destruction. Soldiers began to perish not from the cold or Russian bullets, but from exposure to a contaminated territory. Mysterious weakness, mass sickness, loss of orientation. All of this was written off as hunger and dysentery. But if we look at the campaign map as a route through epicenters of radioactive or other technogenic contamination, it becomes clear why only miserable remnants of the troops returned. Those 10,000 survivors out of the 600,000 who entered represent the survival statistics for passing through a zone hit by weapons of mass destruction without protective gear. There is a high probability that the entire War of 1812 was a grand cover-up operation. Napoleon's invasion could have served as a distraction or a cleanup of the territory after a global strike by a third force. While the world watched the movement of regiments and banners, a methodical destruction of the ancient empire's centers was taking place. The French did not march to fight the Russians. They marched into dead lands to witness the end of an era. Scorched earth is not Kutuzov's tactic. It is a statement of the territory's condition before the arrival of any troops. However, it is impossible to completely hide the consequences of a catastrophe of this magnitude. Ash, fused stone, and altered matter did not disappear. They were buried under new pavements and buildings, but they remain as a silent rebuke to official history. These traces lie literally beneath our feet in every old city, and archaeologists know about them perfectly well. But to explain this widespread layer of destruction, they invented a special, very convenient, and completely deceptive term designed to lull the vigilance of the ordinary person. Anyone who has ever been interested in the structure of the historic centers of our cities has encountered the unexplained phenomenon of buried floors. We are told about the so-called cultural layer, centuries of accumulation of dust, dirt, and human waste, which allegedly caused the ground level to rise by meters. However, if you descend into any archaeological excavation or simply look closely at the basement levels of buildings in St. Petersburg, Moscow, or Kazan, this theory crumbles upon contact with reality. We see full-fledged floors with windows and doors going deep underground, buried not by organic compost, but by dense clay mixed with broken brick and a strange substance resembling ash. This layer, which official archaeology delicately terms the cultural gap of the early 19th century, is actually material evidence of a catastrophe. Chemical analysis of soil from these layers often reveals microparticles identical to those formed during high-temperature sintering. This is not just dirt. These are the decomposition products of urban infrastructure. But the most striking discovery awaits researchers studying the condition of masonry and fortifications. Across Russia, as well as in Europe and Asia, there are traces of vitrification, the process of turning solid matter into glass. To turn silicate brick or granite blocks into a glass-like mass, a temperature exceeding 1,700 degrees Celsius is required. An ordinary wood fire, even the strongest one, is incapable of creating such conditions. Nevertheless, we find melted fortress walls where the stone flowed like oil, freezing in bizarre drips. In the foundations of buildings that survived 1812, thermal metamorphosis of minerals is observed. This means the heat was not only extreme, but instantaneous. The internal structure of the stone changed at the molecular level, which is only possible under the influence of powerful light radiation or a thermal shock wave. Granite on the embankments of St. Petersburg peels off in scales in places, which is a characteristic sign of thermal shock, not water or time. Beneath the pavements of modern megacities lies a continuous layer consisting of sand, metal, and glass sintered into a monolith. This is that very black glossy mass which construction workers often mistake for strange bedrock. In reality, these are the remains of a former civilization, ground down and fused into a single whole by monstrous energy. The layer of clay covering the first floors is likely the result of millions of tons of soil falling from the atmosphere after explosions, or the consequence of soil liquefaction from vibrations of incredible force. We are literally walking on the rooftops of a world destroyed 200 years ago. These vitrified ruins and cities buried under layers of radioactive ash serve as irrefutable proof of the use of weapons far exceeding the power of anything officially existing in 19th century arsenals. Technology capable of melting cities into glass requires an energy source incomparable to gunpowder and cannonballs. This raises the most important and dangerous question of this investigation. Who possessed such crushing power? And, even more importantly, against whom was it used with such ruthless precision? We are approaching the solution to a mystery that cartographers and historians tried to erase from human memory: the existence of a vast state entity that became the main target of this undeclared war. When we piece together these scattered facts, melted granite, the global synchronicity of fires, symptoms of radiation sickness in eyewitnesses, and the strange behavior of armies, a picture emerges that is frightening in its logical completeness. All these anomalies find an explanation in only one case. If we acknowledge that the events of 1812 were not a war between nations, but a coordinated operation to destroy a specific civilizational structure. This structure, this massive geopolitical entity, was erased not only from the face of the earth, but also from the pages of history textbooks. Its name was Great Tartaria. On old maps and in encyclopedias published before the 19th century, this territory was designated as the largest state in the world, stretching from the Urals to the Pacific Ocean and encompassing significant parts of North America and India. Official history today calls this a myth or simply a geographical term, but the nature of the destruction in 1812 suggests otherwise. Strikes were delivered precisely and simultaneously against the key centers of this very empire. Moscow, as the ancient capital of Tartaria, Washington, and the cities of India. All were nodal points of a single global system that had to be dismantled to establish a new world order. The Napoleonic Wars and conflicts in America served as the perfect smokescreen. While the attention of the public was fixed on the movement of infantry and cavalry, strikes were launched from the skies, or using unknown installations, grinding cities into dust. The hypothesis of nuclear weapon usage in the 19th century seems fantastic only at first glance. If we turn to ancient texts, for example, the Indian epic Mahabharata, we find technical descriptions of weapons that are identical in their effect to what happened in Moscow. The texts describe a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, and a column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns. The consequences of using this weapon described in antiquity, hair and nails falling out, poisoning of water and food, instantaneous turning of people into ash, exactly repeat the medical reports of 1812. Perhaps the technologies of destruction were not reinvented in the 20th century, but were retrieved from secret vaults. This could have been the legacy of the gods, or remnants of technologies from a previous cycle of human development, used by one of the warring factions. Who pushed the button? Was it an external force cleansing the planet? Or a brutal civil war of elites deciding to redivide the world? Most likely, we are observing the finale of a struggle between the advancing Western civilization, represented by the Romanovs and European monarchies, and the ancient confederation of Tartaria. The victors got everything: territories, resources, and the right to write history. To hide a crime of this magnitude, it was necessary not just to rewrite books, but to alter the perception of reality. We were indoctrinated to believe that the steam engine was the pinnacle of progress at that time, so we would not dare to think of the existence of more powerful forces. The destruction of Tartaria became a bifurcation point, a moment when humanity was forcibly thrown back in development, stripped of memory and technology. We do not live in a world of linear progress, but on the ruins of a more advanced civilization whose greatness was burned out by fire and consigned to oblivion. They invented a new, safe history for us about musketeers and emperors so that we would never ask questions about whose bones actually lie in the foundation of the modern world. This journey, which began with a single glance at a painting in St. Petersburg's Hermitage, has led us to conclusions that are frightening in their scale and irreversibility. The painting, The Great Fire, turned out to be neither allegory nor artistic exaggeration, but a documentary testimony that breached a wall of 200 years of silence. We have traveled from the strange spectrum of light on a canvas to the realization of the global nature of the catastrophe that engulfed the planet in the early 19th century. The facts we have examined, from the physics of melting stone to medical descriptions of radiation sickness, from the global synchronicity of fires to the disappearance of the Grand Army, assemble into a single puzzle that cannot be taken apart. The official version of history, claiming the world lived in an era of primitive muskets and horse-drawn power, is bursting at the seams under the pressure of material evidence. The main question that remains after this investigation is, why have we been lied to for 2 centuries? The answer lies in the very essence of modern civilization. To acknowledge a nuclear 1812 means to acknowledge that human history is not a linear process of ascent from savagery to progress. It means acknowledging the fact of involution, of degradation. We have not reached the peak of technological development. We are merely trying to recover what was lost. Modern civilization is built on ruins. It parasitizes on the remnants of Great Tartaria's infrastructure, appropriating its achievements but failing to preserve its knowledge. Those majestic buildings with columns and incredible masonry, which we call antique style or classicism, are often not the creations of 19th century architects, but restored ruins that the new masters of the world adapted for their needs. Realizing this fact changes one's sense of self. We are not pioneers of a new world. We are the descendants of those who survived a nuclear hell. Our ancestors are the few whose genetic code withstood the radiation, those who managed to adapt in a world where the cultural layer became a grave for billions. The so-called technological breakthrough of the late 19th century was not the invention of the new, but possibly just the excavation and adaptation of surviving technologies of the past. Electricity, wireless communication, stone processing methods. All this could have been commonplace for that empire which was ground into dust, leaving us only fairy tales about Napoleon and Kutuzov as a screen to hide the true tragedy. This knowledge is heavy, but it is liberating. Understanding what really happened, we stop blindly believing textbooks written by the victors and begin to see reality as it is. Melted forts, buried floors, strange cancer statistics, and the year without a summer, all are links in the same chain. History was rewritten, facts distorted, and memory wiped, but the traces remain. Stone remembers what people have forgotten. And now that you know where to look, you can no longer unsee this evidence. The world around you is filled with the scars of that war, and every ancient mansion with windows going under the asphalt screams about what really happened here. History is rewritten, but the traces remain. If you want to know the truth that is hidden from us in school textbooks, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Write in the comments, have you noticed strange melted buildings in your city?